Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let's come to topic number 9 of our analysis of contemporary international political problems. We will deal with nuclear spread, nuclear proliferation. The subtitle of today's chapter is somehow provocative. More should be better than worse. The question then deals with the advantages and the disadvantages of nuclear proliferation versus nuclear non-proliferation. I would like to start this analysis with a quote from an editorial published by the New York Times last August 6, 2020. August 6th, that is to say, for the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombing on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The title of this editorial is the following one: "The world can still be destroyed in a flash." The world can still be destroyed in a flash. Here is an excerpt, 2 sentences of this editorial, which reads as follows: "The nuclear weapons dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki 75 years ago this week, 6 and 9 August, caused a devastation never before seen in human warfare. Yet, these bombs were firecrackers compared with the nuclear weapons that were soon developed after 45 and that are still capable nowadays of vaporizing the human race in an apocalyptic flash." So the allusion of the New York Times editorial, of course, is an allusion to America bombing in 1945 the 2 Japanese cities of Hiroshima, August 6, and Nagasaki, August 9. 2 atomic bombs. The first one was called Little Boy. The second was called Fat Man. And they were the fruit of the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was the massive research program to which the then American government, Franklin Roosevelt, had dedicated billions of dollars, thousands of scientists, engineers, because, of course, the Roosevelt administration was worried that Hitler's regime might be the first to obtain this weapon. And the Manhattan Project had tested the first atomic bomb ever built, called the Gadget, in some weeks before launching the 2 bombs on Japan in the New Mexican desert, in the southern part of the US, close to the Mexican border. The atomic bombing caused the immediate death in Japan, caused the immediate death of 67,000 people. And 36,000 more people died during the next weeks or so, without mentioning the long-term impact of these 2 bombs. After this bombings, and immediately after these bombings, and ever since then, as proven by the New York Times editorial, ever since then, what John Mueller, an American scholar, called the atomic obsession or the nuclear alarmism, ever since then, this nuclear alarmism, the nuclear fear, flourished among Western observers, academics, journalists, politicians. Nuclear fear fueled, of course, by apocalyptic visions relative to the consequences of the potential use of nuclear weapons. The potential consequences upon mankind itself, the future, the survival of mankind. And I would like to give you some very significant illustrations of this nuclear fear, put forward statements, analysis, predictions put forward by some of the best and the brightest politicians or experts. The first one, 1945, only 10 weeks after the bombings in October 1945, George Orwell, you know George Orwell for his 1984 novel, for his Animal Farm novel, George Orwell, in an article, made the following prediction. We, talking of mankind, we all are likely to be blown into pieces. We will be blown into pieces by the new atomic bomb within the next 5 years. Within the next 5 years. So in 45, he expected that atomic bombs would blow up mankind not later than 1950. First example. Second illustration, 1946. The American strategic thinker Bernard Brodie published a book. The title is significant: The Absolute Weapon. The absolute weapon is the name he gave to the atomic bomb, which he considered to have I quote, a fantastically great destructive power. A fantastically great destructive power. Of course, he emphasized the fact that this weapon, being an absolute weapon, was radically different from all other weapons that had been invented before. And that therefore, of course, this weapon would have a significant impact upon world politics. Illustration number 3, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists was, the first issue was published in June 1947. Please have a look at the file on Moodle, document number 1. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists was and still is a magazine founded by some Western and above all American scientists, maybe feeling guilty to have contributed to the invention of the nuclear weapon. And so they feeling somehow guilty, they wanted to warn the world, emphasizing the risks of this new nuclear weapon. So they invented the very famous doomsday clock, the doomsday clock, and they put doomsday clock on the cover page of the first issue, June 1947, of their bulletin. So what then does and what did and what does still nowadays this doomsday clock consist in? It is a symbolic clock, of course, that represented and still represents a kind of countdown to a possible nuclear war. The aim was to warn people and politicians about the risks of a kind of nuclear Armageddon in the case of using nuclear weapons. And ever since then, the clock was poised at some minutes to midnight. Midnight meaning the end of mankind. So 7 minutes to midnight in 1947. 2 minutes to midnight from 53 to 1960, that is to say, during different major crises of the Cold War. 17 to midnight after the immediate end of the Cold War, so to some extent the less dangerous years since 1945 were the years 1991 to 1994. Nowadays, 2020, the clock is updated during the last week of January. So the last one goes back to January 2020, 100 seconds to midnight, but for some 10 years, a bit more than 10 years, the magazine includes global warming as another perspective, a catastrophic calamity, and not merely the risk of a nuclear war. Anyway, illustration number 4, Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, the father of the nuclear bomb. He belonged, of course, to those scientists who created the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And what did he think? He thought that as long, I quote, as there are sovereign powers, war is possessing nuclear weapons, of course, nuclear war is inevitable. In other words, for Albert Einstein, in order to prevent a nuclear war, the only means to do so is to establish a world government controlling the nuclear weapons, which at that time, 1947, the US were the Americans were the only to possess. No other state at that time had managed to obtain nuclear weapons, to build nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union will be the second in 1949. Let's jump to the 1960s. The 1960s, John F. Kennedy will be the American president, supposedly the best and the brightest, as he was called. And he predicted at the beginning of the 1960s that, I quote, by 1970, there will be 15 and maybe even 20 nuclear powers. This was his prediction at the beginning of the 60s. There were 3, 4, 5 after the US and the USSR. Great Britain in the 50s, France in 62, and China in 64. So he was dead in 1964, Kennedy. So when he put forward his prediction, there were 4 nuclear powers. He expected 15 or 20 states to possess nuclear weapons by 1970. And I go on quoting, I, Kennedy, regard this possibility of 20 states being nuclear powers, I regard this as the greatest possible danger in the 1960s, the beginning of the 1960s. In 1979, 1 year before he passed away, Hans Morgenthau, American classical realist, theorist, being a realist, he bets on the continuity of international politics, no change ever since antiquity, no change in the future. International politics will always be power politics. But he acknowledged that maybe the nuclear revolution was the first somehow significant revolution, introducing a kind of change in international politics. And regarding the future, this is what he said, the world is moving in 1979. The world is moving towards a third world war, a strategic nuclear war. This was his prediction. I do not believe, Morgenthau, do not believe that anything can be done to prevent such a nuclear war to which the world is moving, according to Morgenthau in 1979. He died in 1980. After the end of the Cold War, 1993, the CIA, in its annual report, analyzed the situation, international situation after the end of the Cold War. There was no more USSR. So this is what they said, the CIA, we have slain a large dragon, the large dragon that had been slain. The Americans had been able to get rid of which dragon? The USSR. But new dangers emerge, new dangers. We now live in a jungle of poisonous snakes. We now live in a jungle of poisonous snakes. The poisonous snakes concerned were in this CIA report those states eager, according to the CIA, to acquire weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons. That is to say, those that were called a bit later rogue states or weapon states: Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, North Korea, Cuba, etc. The CIA even predicted that Japan and Germany would be tempted to acquire nuclear weapons, but being American allies, the CIA did not call them poisonous snakes, of course. 1993, 10 years later, in 2003, George Bush Jr. Launched his attack against Saddam Hussein, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and among the many justifications that he put forward, he also alluded to the risk of Saddam Hussein being eager and being about to possess nuclear weapons. This is what he said. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that in the 1990s, Saddam Hussein had an advanced nuclear weapons development program. The British government, I go on quoting, has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa. Our intelligence sources, the CIA, tell us that he has attempted to purchase material suitable for nuclear weapons production. So George Bush was afraid of Saddam Hussein possessing nuclear weapons. 1 year later, 2004, that is to say 3 years after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, Graham Allison, he who in 2017, we mentioned this in another chapter, analyzed the future of the American-Chinese rivalry. In 2004, he published a book called Nuclear Terrorism, after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, of course. Nuclear terrorism, the subtitle, The Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe. And this is what he claimed on the current path, 2004. A nuclear terrorist attack on America in the decade ahead, 2004, the decade ahead, 2014. In the decade ahead, a nuclear terrorist attack on America is more likely than not. In other words, Allison expected in this book, and he is also an expert with some influence on American policymakers, he expected a nuclear terrorist attack. 2015, the Obama administration, together with the other four official nuclear powers, we'll come back to this, plus Germany, the 5+1 group, signed the nuclear deal with Iran. And this nuclear deal was rejected by Israel. Listen to Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu commenting on this deal. In a decade, this is what he said in 2015, this deal will give a terrorist regime the capacity to produce many bombs. Actually, an entire nuclear arsenal with the means to deliver it, that is to say, the missiles. Israel, talking of Israel, of course, being Israel's prime minister, is not bound by this deal with Iran because Iran continues to seek our destruction, the destruction of Israel. We will always defend ourselves. So the prospective acquisition of nuclear weapons by Iran is considered to be a threat, of course, by Israel. Last but not least, Donald Trump, in 2017, commenting on North Korea, this is what he said. He called Kim Jong-un rocket man, and he promised that the US would unleash fire and fury. This is the expression used, fire and fury against North Korea in case of North Korea's dictator resorting to nuclear weapons against either the US or an ally of the US in the region. He, however, changed his mind. Very strange. He changed his mind, well, not that strange regarding Trump anyway, and started to negotiate with North Korea. He went as far as going to the demilitarized zone separating South from North Korea in 2019. And this is what happened, ladies and gentlemen. Listen to the video when both met in 2019.
President Trump was the first to arrive, walking slowly toward North Korea in the no man's land of the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. Then Kim Jong-un emerged, walking faster to catch up. The two leaders shook hands, Trump on South Korean soil, Kim Jong-un in the north.
Good to see you again. I've never expected to meet you at this place. You feel excellent. Take a step forward. You will be the first US president to cross the border.
They were separated only by a narrow concrete strip, the demarcation line between the two Koreas. President Trump asked and was invited to cross.
I asked him, I said, would you like me to come across the line? He said, I would be honored to do that. I would be honored. Now, I didn't know really what he was going to say, but it was my honor to do it.
The first sitting American president to set foot on North Korean soil. Kim Jong-un then stepped over the line into South Korea. It was chaotic. That President Trump wanted to do this had been circulating for weeks, but the details clearly only came together in the last minute. Security, camera crews, North Korean television got in each other's way. But real history is often messy.
We came over and I said, hey, I'm over here. I want to call up Chairman Kim. And we got to meet, and stepping across that line was a great honor. A lot of progress has been made. A lot of friendships have been made, and this has been in particular a great friendship.
Then the North Korean leader, President Trump, and his advisors and family members went in for extended talks.
And I want to thank Chairman Kim for something else. When I put out the social media notification, if he didn't show up, the press was going to make me look very bad. So you made us both look good, and I appreciate it. But we've developed a great relationship.
The Demilitarized Zone is one of the most unique and tense places on Earth. 160 miles long, 2.5 miles wide, it straddles the border between North and South Korea, with the demarcation line running up the middle. The zone was set up in 1953 after the Korean War to de-escalate hostilities, a safe place where enemies can meet. Today being used exactly what it was built for. What was supposed to be 5 minutes lasted over an hour. President Trump walking on back to his side of the border.
So Trump was very proud to meet Chairman Kim. He was not interested in meeting the Iranian leader, as indeed in 2018, after reversing America's policy towards North Korea, he also reversed America's policy towards Iran. That is to say, he decided that America should no longer be part of the nuclear deal that had been signed by Obama in 2015. Listen to Donald Trump. Maybe it will be the last time that you hear him, given the fate that arrived to him 2 or 3 days ago in the American presidential elections. Listen to Trump announcing America's withdrawal from the deal, the nuclear joint deal with Iran.
My fellow Americans, today I want to update the world on our efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. The Iranian regime is the leading state sponsor of terror. It exports dangerous missiles, fuels conflicts across the Middle East, and supports terrorist proxies and militias such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda. Over the years, Iran and its proxies have bombed American embassies and military installations, murdered hundreds of American service members, and kidnapped, imprisoned, and tortured American citizens. The Iranian regime has funded its long reign of chaos and terror by plundering the wealth of its own people. No action taken by the regime has been more dangerous than its pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means of delivering them. In 2015, the previous administration joined with other nations in a deal regarding Iran's nuclear program. This agreement was known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA. In theory, the so-called Iran deal was supposed to protect the United States and our allies from the lunacy of an Iranian nuclear bomb, a weapon that will only endanger the survival of the Iranian regime. In fact, the deal allowed Iran to continue enriching uranium and, over time, reach the brink of a nuclear break-in. The fact is, this was a horrible one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. It didn't bring calm, it didn't bring peace, and it never will. In the years since the deal was reached, Iran's military budget has grown by almost 40%, while its economy is doing very badly. After the sanctions were lifted, the dictatorship used its new funds to build nuclear-capable missiles, support terrorism, and cause havoc throughout the Middle East and beyond. The agreement was so poorly negotiated that even if Iran fully complies, the regime can still be on the verge of a nuclear breakout in just a short period of time. The deal's sunset provisions are totally unacceptable. If I allowed this deal to stand, there would soon be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Everyone would want their weapons ready by the time Iran had theirs. In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. In a few moments, I will sign a presidential memorandum to begin reinstating US nuclear sanctions on the Iranian regime.
Joe Biden, president-elect, is supposed to announce very soon that America will come back to the Paris Agreement, to the World Health Organization, maybe even to the UNESCO. We do not know exactly what he will be doing regarding this Iranian deal, nuclear deal, but for sure, he will make sure to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, which amounts to saying that indeed, ever since 1945, the kind of nuclear obsession, to quote once again John Mueller, obviously characterizes a lot of people, be they politicians, be they journalists, be they experts, or even academics. I would like to compare this kind of nuclear fear, this kind of nuclear alarmism, I would like to compare it with the empirical record. And to say the least, all the predictions, all the analyses that I mentioned were proven wrong, absolutely wrong. First of all, despite George Orwell, no nuclear bomb ever blew up since Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. No nuclear weapon has been fired against a target, against an enemy, by any of the nuclear powers, which amounts to saying, ladies and gentlemen, that the only state that used nuclear weapons, well, are the United States of America. Those states, others than the US, never used these weapons, and the US itself stopped using them after August 9, 1945. Second argument, no world government was established. And despite Einstein, no major war among nuclear weapon states did break out. So there was no need up to now to establish a world government to prevent a nuclear war from occurring. Argument number three, or refutation number three. In 2020, there are not 10 or 15 or 20 nuclear powers as expected by the best and the brightest American president in the 1960s, John F. Kennedy, who considered that in 1970, that is to say 50 years ago, there would be 15 to 20 nuclear powers. There are 9 nuclear powers. 9, that is to say the 5 official nuclear powers, who happen also to be the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the 5 nuclear official, those who signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We'll come back to this treaty at the end of this chapter. That is to say, chronologically speaking, the US, the USSR, the UK, France, and China, plus 3 states that acquired nuclear weapons while never having signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which amounts to saying that they do not violate it. They did not, and they do not violate it. You cannot violate a treaty if you are not a member of a treaty. India, Pakistan, and Israel. Israel never acknowledged the existence of its nuclear weapon, but everybody agrees in saying that nuclear fire is possessed by Israel. So 8, plus 1, North Korea. North Korea for sure has atomic bombs, A bombs, not H bombs, hydrogen bomb. Probably it does not possess them, but absolutely nobody can be sure about this. Does it possess the means to deliver them? That is to say, we should make a difference between an atomic bomb and an atomic weapon. An atomic bomb is a bomb, but an atomic weapon is a bomb which can be put into a warhead. It's a nuclear warhead that can be put on a missile in order to be sent to launch against the target. Maybe North Korea possesses these nuclear missiles, but as usual, secrecy prevails. So 9 nuclear powers. What's more, if we remember Kennedy's very pessimistic prediction, various states did abandon either the nuclear bomb or their nuclear program. South Africa decided to destroy, at the very beginning of the 1990s, the 6 nuclear bombs that it possessed, that it had developed thanks to a cooperation with Israel. Israel and South Africa, ladies and gentlemen, you are too young to know that, during the Cold War, were 2 of the 4 states called the Pariah States. They were called Pariah States by the then majority of the UN General Assembly, which was a majority of third world, more or less self-proclaimed progressist regimes. So they designated 4 states to be Pariah States: South Africa, Israel, South Korea, and Taiwan. Taiwan because it prevented China from becoming unified. South Korea because it prevented North Korea from unifying Korea, the Korean Peninsula. Israel because of its policy towards the Palestinians, and South Africa, of course, because of its apartheid policy. So since Israel was interested in obtaining a nuclear weapon, and since South Africa, the then apartheid regime of the white majority, the white political majority, were interested in having nuclear weapons to defend themselves against the Arab neighbors regarding Israel, against the revolutionary regimes on its northern borders supported by Cuba and by the USSR regarding South Africa, they cooperated. And Israel needed the South African desert to test its nuclear weapons because of the small size of Israel. Israel, of course, could not do that. So they were looking for some place to test the nuclear weapons, that they managed to obtain an agreement with South Africa. And in a kind of tit-for-tat agreement, Israel accepted to help South Africa to produce its own nuclear bomb, and South Africa does produce 6 nuclear bombs. So the South African white government, before the black majority came to power, decided to destroy, to dismantle these 6 bombs. So this is an example of a state abandoning its nuclear weapons. Argentina and Brazil abandoned their nuclear program, probably because America, the Uncle Sam, told them to do so. And last but not least, the breakup of the Soviet Union, synonymous with the emergence of 4 new nuclear states: Russia, the Russian Federation, but also Kazakhstan, the Ukraine, and Belarus. Since the Soviets, the former Soviet Union's nuclear bombs were deployed in these 4 republics, in different republics, part of the Soviet Union, but which became independent after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. So Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan accepted, of course, to transfer to the Russian Federation, to Moscow, the bombs that had been deployed on their territory. And last but not least, the fifth counter-argument, refutation of one of the last arguments that I mentioned. No terrorist network possessed nuclear weapons, of course, and did not use them by all the more. So there is a kind of huge discourse reality gap. The discourse is alarmist, the reality is much less. How can we explain this huge gap? I will dedicate 2 sections in my argumentation. One, analyzing the Cold War, the period of the Cold War, in order to explain why the nuclear arms race opposing the Soviets to the Americans never escalated into a hot war, into an armed nuclear confrontation between the 2 major powers due to their doctrine, nuclear doctrine. And then I will look at the post-Cold War world, today's world, which sometimes is called the second nuclear age, to distinguish it from the first one, the Cold War, in other words. And I would go as far as saying that in today's world, the risks of any nuclear war are even smaller than they used to be during the Cold War. So let's start with the analysis of the Cold War, the political situation of the Cold War. I quoted some minutes ago the very pessimistic predictions, George Orwell, Einstein, etc. And these predictions, of course, immediately after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these are pessimistic predictions, of course, were due to the very specific nature of the atomic bomb, of the nuclear weapon. This specific nature had been witnessed during the explosions of the bombs in Japan. I mentioned the huge amount of victims immediately killed by the bomb. And this destructive nature, this specificity, was of course increased due to the innovations of the nuclear bomb, from an atomic bomb to a hydrogen thermonuclear bomb. And this specificity regards the 3 effects, killing effects of the nuclear bomb. The first effect, characterizing a nuclear weapon when compared to former conventional weapons, the first specificity is the so-called overkill capacity. The overkill capacity, that is to say, the destructions likely to be caused by a nuclear bomb are unprecedented. They are so huge that they are absolutely unprecedented. And according to an American scholar, Carl Leiber, War and the Engineers, is the title of his book, a contemporary, up-to-date intercontinental nuclear warhead launched by an intercontinental missile. One single nuclear warhead concentrates a destructive capacity equivalent to all the bombs used throughout the 6 years of World War II by all the belligerents combined. One single warhead has such a destructive capacity. Overkill. Not merely overkill, but also mutual kill. The mutual kill effect refers to the fact that, of course, ever since the US lost its nuclear monopoly, that is to say, from 1949 onwards, when the USSR was the second nuclear power, ever since America lost its nuclear monopoly, nuclear powers know that if they use their weapon against another nuclear state, this other state will have the capacity, the second strike capacity, that's how it's called, the second strike capacity, in order to retaliate, to counterattack if you prefer. Which amounts to saying that both are likely to be killed, the mutual kill effect. So the attacker itself is likely to pass away in the case of attacking, because the target will always be able to retaliate. And the third specificity of the nuclear weapon is its instant kill capacity. Instant kill because from the second that a statesman pushes on the nuclear button to the second where the nuclear bomb reaches its target, at best only some minutes will have passed. In other words, the killing will be immediate everywhere in the world, because thanks to both short range, middle range, and long range intercontinental missiles launched either by aircraft or by submarines, or from the land, of course, the targets of such a bomb will always be hit within some minutes, at best or at worst. So huge destructive capacities, immediate destruction, and reciprocal death. And this is the reason why immediately after the use of the first bombs, politicians became aware that something had to be done in order to avert, to prevent these weapons to be used. The first one to become aware of the unprecedented impact of nuclear weapons upon international politics was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, who emphasized the potential pervert, but in this case positive, consequences of this new weapon. This is what he said: safety may become the sturdy, the robust, the sturdy child of nuclear terror. Safety may be the consequence, the robust consequence of nuclear weapons. This is what has been called the Churchill Counterfactual, or the curious paradox. That is to say, since nowadays those who possess nuclear weapons know that in the case they use them, they will have to face the risk of their own death, they forcefully will behave with caution on the international scene. This is according to John Mueller in his analysis of the Cold War. The reason why the Cold War actually was a long peace, a long nuclear peace. This is the reason why the Cold War remained cold and not escalated into a hot war. Why? Because war among the US and the USSR, both being nuclear powers, was no more irrational. Ladies and gentlemen, war in the Clausewitzian conception is but the mere continuation of policy by other means. The mere continuation of policy by other means, that is to say, when the normal means of foreign policy, that is to say, diplomacy, in other words, negotiations, dialogue, bargaining, when these means fail, when the state cannot obtain satisfaction thanks to these non-violent means, then war becomes rational. Then it may be rational for a state to go to war. This conception was valid before the nuclear weapon was invented. Why? Because any policymaker could somehow be optimistic, even in the case he was not completely sure that he would win the war that he was about to launch. He could hope rationally and reasonably that with the passage of time, the horrors of the wars that he had lost would be forgotten to some extent. This is no more true. With the new nuclear weapon, the absolute weapon, given the risk of so-called nuclear winter, it's to say the suicide, death of mankind, or of a very significant part of mankind, no more optimism is possible in the mind of statesmen, considering the possibility to go to war among nuclear powers because there is escalating into a nuclear war. And therefore, this kind of crystal ball, which the nuclear revolution introduced in world politics, permitting the stateswomen, to foresee their potential own suicide, of course, incites everybody to be cautious. A nuclear war has too high a cost, too high a price to pay. Nobody accepts to pay such a price. There is no more rational relationship between war, potentially nuclear, as means and whatever objective of foreign policy. Therefore, states abandoned, nuclear powers abandoned during the Cold War, mostly, first and foremost, the Soviet and the Americans. Therefore, they abandoned war as a means to obtain satisfaction. This awareness by the two major powers, but the same is true for the other official nuclear powers during the Cold War. This is the section dealing with the Cold War period. This awareness has been called the nuclear taboo. The nuclear taboo, Tannenwald's book, everybody agrees in not using the nuclear weapon. The nuclear taboo leads nuclear states, to exclude nuclear weapons as an instrument to be used in their foreign policy actions. All the statesmen agreed with this. I would like to quote the French General de Gaulle. This is what he said in the 1960s. In the case of a nuclear war, and this is the reason why we should not use them, in the case of a nuclear war, the two parties will have no more power, no more laws, no more cities, no more culture, no more cradles, no more tombstones. No more cradles, no more tombstones. The end of human life. And the same idea was put forward by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev when they met in 1985 in Iceland, Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland. They met in order to start their disarmament talks. They started the START agreement, START strategic arms reduction talks, which led them to dismantle a very, very significant part of their huge nuclear arsenal. At that time, the Soviets and the Americans had about 40,000 nuclear warheads, a bit more than 40,000 for the Soviets, a bit less for the Americans, and they went down. They agreed in going down to 6,000 to 7,000 nowadays, which is still a huge number, but 5 to 6 times less, significant less numerous warheads than was the case, than used to be the case in the past. So all the statesmen agreed in no longer considering war as a possible instrument of foreign policy. What did they do then? Well, since they possessed nuclear weapon, what did they do? They put into practice the recommendation that Bernard Brodie had given to policymakers immediately after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1946. This is what Bernard Brodie had said: the chief purpose in the past, the chief purpose of our military was to win wars. From now on, 46, from now on, its chief purpose must to prevent wars. It can have no other useful purpose. The only purpose of contemporary armies is to avert wars because of the risk of these wars becoming nuclear wars. To put it differently, nuclear weapons were perceived and conceived as deterrent weapons, as means of deterrence, and not as means of attack. They were built not to be used in attack. They were built in order to prevent another state from attacking, or in order to be used in the case of a counterattack. That is to say, as a second strike, but not as a first use. This is the so-called non-first use doctrine of the official nuclear powers. Weapons, nuclear weapons, are not considered to be used by a first state. A state only will use it as a second strike in the case it is attacked. So if nobody takes the initiative to attacking, nobody will need to retaliate. And if nobody then uses nuclear weapons, then no nuclear war will break out. This does not mean, ladies and gentlemen, that peace, perpetual peace, is necessarily guaranteed. Why? Because of the so-called nuclear paradox, or because of the so-called stability-instability paradox. This concept, stability-instability paradox, refers to the distinction that should be made between the nuclear level and the non- or infra-nuclear level of warfare. Stability exists at the nuclear level, but this does not necessarily mean that stability also will be prevailing at the infra-nuclear level. That is to say, nuclear stability is due to the fact that everybody agrees in the non-first use doctrine. Nobody dares to use, to be the first power to use nuclear weapons. Okay, but, and here is the paradox which induces an instability at the infra or non-nuclear level. If everybody agrees in not using, in not being the first power to use nuclear weapons, and if everybody knows that everybody will not dare to be the first to use nuclear weapons, then everybody can come to the conclusion, no one will use nuclear weapons, so I feel free to use non-nuclear, infra-nuclear, conventional weapons to wage a war. So the nuclear stability does not necessarily entail or imply a non-nuclear stability. If everybody agrees in not using nuclear weapons, if everybody knows that nobody will dare to use nuclear weapons, then everybody can come to the conclusion, I can dare to start a non-nuclear war because nobody will dare to escalate. In other words, to believe that nuclear weapons will prevent any kind of war, to believe this is to believe in magic to some extent. And the historical comparison can be made here, ladies and gentlemen. I think it is helpful. The historical comparison is the so-called chemical taboo. Chemical weapons were used during World War I in Belgium by German troops, and at that time they were somehow perceived as potentially suicidal weapons too. And this is the reason why everybody decided not to use them. And the existence of chemical weapons did not prevent future wars from breaking out. First and foremost, World War II. Not even Hitler used chemical weapons on the battlefield. He used gas to massively kill 6 million Jews, of course, and gypsies, of course, but he did not use them on the battlefields. And ever since then, with some fairly rare exceptions, chemical weapons were not used in the different wars that took place since World War II. Americans used chemical defoliants during the Vietnam War in order to destroy the forest cover that profited the Viet Cong, the Viet Minh, the communist guerrilla. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons to get rid of some of his own population, the Kurds. Of course, also to stop Iranian counter-attacking and invading his territory. Assad is said to have used chemical weapons to get rid of his adversaries, notably in Aleppo during the civil war that is still going on in Syria nowadays. But no large-scale use of chemical weapons. Saddam Hussein, for instance, during in 1990, 1991, when he was attacked by America's Operation Desert Storm, never used the chemical weapons or any other weapon of mass destruction, biological weapon, and of course not nuclear weapons, but he had none, when he launched 2 or 3 missiles against Israel in January 1991. The missiles were not had no chemical warheads. He was rational enough to know that the retaliation of the Israelis would be without any mercy, of course. Regarding nuclear weapons exist, have been existing, therefore, since 1945, and they did not prevent non-nuclear disputes among nuclear powers. The one example, there will be a second one to which I will come back a bit later. The example I refer to, of course, is the Chinese, Russian, or Soviet, should I say, the rigorous, the Soviet-Chinese armed dispute in 1969 at their far eastern border along the Amur River. Some Chinese and some Soviet soldiers were killed. So this non-nuclear dispute was not prevented, but it did not escalate either into a nuclear confrontation between the two, which amounts to saying that during this Cold War, obviously, no nuclear war occurred. And therefore, to some extent, the Cold War was a long peace, and more specifically, if we agree with Gaddis's analysis, a long nuclear peace. Yes, nuclear weapons did stabilize the relationships between the then 2 major powers. Are things different, ladies and gentlemen, since the end of the Cold War? Are we living in the second nuclear age? Second, because different and actually more dangerous than the first one, which came to an end without any nuclear war. The majority of people would say yes to this, would answer yes to this question. The second nuclear age absolutely, definitely is completely different. There is one very important and significant exception to this consensus, an academic exception. Kenneth Waltz, in his The Spread of Nuclear Weapons. This is the book that was published by Waltz together with Scott Sagan. This debate, controversy. Kenneth Waltz had published as early as 1984, as far as I remember, maybe 1981, I don't know, 1984, a short essay called The Spread of Nuclear Weapons, More May Be Better. More may be better. And he then started a debate with Scott Sagan, who is opposed to this idea, who, in other words, is part of the majority of people thinking that the second nuclear age is different. We'll come back to Kenneth Waltz because he also is favorable to, was favorable, he died 7 years ago, was favorable to Iran getting the nuclear bomb. Why Iran should get the bomb, I put his argumentation in the file, document number 3 of the file you can find on Mueller. So for the majority of experts, of politicians, of journalists, of strategic thinkers too, the second nuclear age is different from the first one. And therefore, nuclear proliferation should be prevented. We have to prevent any other political unit from acquiring a nuclear weapon. This, ladies and gentlemen, and here is my personal opinion or analysis, this is contradictory. It is self-contradictory. If the Cold War remained cold, thanks to the nuclear weapons, and this is what Gaddis says, this is what Brody would say, this is what the different theorists emphasizing, the 3 killing effects, mutual kill, instant kill, overkill capacity, etc. If the specificity of the nuclear weapon contributes to explain why the Cold War remained cold, that is to say, remained peaceful. And if politicians want peace to prevail, and this is what they tell us, all the politicians want peace to prevail, and you know that politicians do never lie, do they? Then the more nuclear weapons, the more peace. Which amounts to saying that nuclear powers should be favorable to nuclear spread. And yet, this is not the case. This is absolutely not the case. Ever since nuclear powers have nuclear weapons, they do aim at preventing other states from acquiring nuclear weapons. And this is the reason why the 5 first ones did, so-called official, they established the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in 1968, in order to prevent any other state from acquiring nuclear weapons. And this is the reason why they are not happy with North Korea acquiring nuclear weapons, and they are not happy with Iran eager to become a nuclear power. This is why they obtained the nuclear deal with Iran, and we will see in the future what will happen in this domain. So this kind of contradiction, which I consider to be a contradiction, is of course justified, that is to say, for those who are favorable to prevent any nuclear spread, any further nuclear spread. For those people, there are serious arguments. And 4 major arguments are put forward, emphasizing the difference between today's world, the second nuclear age, and the Cold War period. First argument is that in the past, and nowadays still, but regarding the official nuclear powers, official nuclear powers were able and still are able to keep their nuclear forces under control, under political control. As proven during 2 important crises when there was a kind of risk of a nuclear escalation, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1973, the Kipper or October War, when the Soviets and the Americans threatened to resort to their nuclear weapons in order to obtain a stalemate in the war opposing Egypt, notably, to Israel. So these crises prove that the major official nuclear powers are able to control their nuclear forces, but, and here's then the difference, this will not necessarily be the case in the future. There is a risk of future nuclear states being unable to control, because they lack control nuclear weapons, because they may lack political stability. First argument. Second argument, imagine one regional power, one local important secondary power acquire a nuclear weapon. This will force inside its neighbors to acquire nuclear weapons. In other words, there will be a kind of regional domino effect. If Iran, then Saudi Arabia, maybe Turkey. If North Korea, then South Korea, Japan, etc., etc. We have to prevent this from happening. Second argument, the destabilizing regional domino effect. Third argument, existing nuclear powers have been guided and still are guided nowadays by the deterrence doctrine, the non-first use doctrine. This may not be the case in the future regarding prospective nuclear rogue states, such as precisely North Korea or Iran. They may be eager to acquire nuclear weapons in order to promote aggressive goals. And last but not least, the spread of nuclear weapons is not necessarily limited to states. And the more states acquire nuclear weapons, the higher the risk of non-state networks possessing nuclear weapons, because the more states are possessing nuclear weapons, the more may be tempted to transfer their nuclear bombs to networks, terrorist networks, which are ideologically close to them and which they might be tempted to use to further to promote their aggressive goals precisely. So these are the 4 arguments or sets of arguments put forward by the analysts and the practitioners emphasizing the difference between today's second nuclear age and the past Cold War nuclear age. I would like to have a critical look at these arguments in order to refute them. Argument number one, potential future nuclear states may lack political stability, are characterized by political stability. This argument is fairly easy to be refuted. To refute. Why? Because for states, in order to obtain a nuclear weapon, in order to acquire, in order to be able to acquire, to build and to acquire, and to possess a nuclear weapon, must be stable over the long run, because political stability is the precondition to manage the process of production, the long-term process of production of a nuclear weapon. If then the government is unstable, which is presupposed by those who claim that future political nuclear powers may lack political stability, if then the government is unstable, it will not have time enough to establish, to build a nuclear weapon. Best example, empirically illustrating, corroborating this counter-argument of the first argument of the second nuclear age theorists, is North Korea precisely. North Korea probably acquired nuclear weapons, but it is probably one of the most stable regimes in the world, because governed by the same family, the grandfather, the father, and the son, for 70 years now. In other words, what is the major aim of autocrats? It's to stay in power. Their aim being to stay in power, they will be rational enough not to use nuclear weapons in the case they manage to obtain it, because they know that if they would be courageous or foolish enough to use nuclear weapons, they would be wiped off the earth. Look at similar autocrats accused of being eager to acquire nuclear weapons. Gaddafi was dictator was in power from 1969 to 2011. He was killed, maybe by French special forces, but nobody will tell us what happened exactly. 69, 2011, that is to say, 42 long years. He was accused of being eager to acquire nuclear weapons. He was pretty often accused of having staged different terrorist attacks. He staged a terrorist attack against a nightclub in Berlin, where American GIs were known for having a good time. Ronald Reagan, as a retaliation, bombed the Libyan regime in 1986, and Gaddafi ever since then behaved prudently. Why? Because his aim was to survive politically as the leader of Libya. The same is true for Saddam Hussein. He came to power in 1978. He was overthrown in 2003, 25 long years. And during the two wars, if we forget the war that he launched against Iran, during the two wars during which he was opposed to the US-led coalition, Desert Storm 91, Iraqi Free in 2003, he was rational enough not to use neither nuclear, nor chemical, no biological weapons. He had no nuclear weapons, of course, but he had chemical ones, maybe biological ones, because he was rational enough not to do so. In other words, if a regime is stable, it will not use nuclear weapons. If a regime is not stable, it will be unable to acquire nuclear weapons. So to claim that future nuclear powers might lack political stability is somehow contradictory. And to claim that the absence of political stability due to a civil control of nuclear weapons is unlikely to characterize future nuclear powers is to suppose that military officers are more often tempted to go to war than civilian leaders. There is no empirical proof of this. The various wars that were waged in the last decades since the end of the Cold War were pretty often promoted by civilian leaders, George Bush, much more than Colin Powell, who had been chief of staff of the American army under George Bush father, Sarkozy in France against Gaddafi, much more than the officers of the French army. I cannot prove this, but I at least feel free to put forward the argument. Argument number two, the risk of a regional domino effect. If state A acquires a nuclear weapon, then his neighbor B, his neighbor C, etc., will be tempted to do so too. Imagine this is the case. Why should such a regional arms race be destabilizing? According to the arguments of those who want proliferation to be prevented, the argument consists in saying that, contrary to the Cold War, the states, the neighbors, the regional neighbors acquiring nuclear weapons will be unable to go through what has been called during the Cold War the nuclear learning process. What was this nuclear learning process? The nuclear learning process was the fact for American and Soviets to get aware, after the peaceful end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, become aware of the risks of a nuclear war breaking out. So what did the Soviet and the Americans do? They learned from this crisis. This is the nuclear learning process. They learned, they experienced the prospective risks of a nuclear war, and so they established all kind of dialogue to prevent such a war from breaking out. Concretely, they established a red hotline between the Kremlin and the White House or the Pentagon, and they started arms control negotiations, and a bit later, disarmament talks. Why should future nuclear dyads, in this case neighbors, be unable to go through this or similar nuclear learning process? Why shouldn't they be able to become aware of the risks? Nobody can answer to this question. I would even like to go further than that by taking the example of India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan are nowadays nuclear powers, both for some 22 or 3 years. At least Pakistan acknowledged to have been able to acquire a nuclear weapon in 1998 when they tested them, and India also tested them. But India had already been able to acquire nuclear weapons some 20 years before, earlier in the 1970s. India had become a nuclear power. Ever since, India has nuclear weapons. And ever since both have nuclear weapons, one single limited war broke out between the two. The Kargil War of 1999. The Kargil War of 1999, a bit more than 1,000 people, soldiers were killed. This limited war must be compared to the three major wars that India and Pakistan fought against each other in 1947, when they became independent, in 1965, the Kashmir issue, in 1971, when the then Eastern Oriental Pakistan, that is to say today's Bangladesh, became independent, is called Bangladesh. So three major wars with 10,000, hundreds of thousands of people killed during 25 years, 47 to 71. one limited war during the last 2 decades and a bit more, since both states have nuclear weapons, which amounts to saying that yes, they were able to go through the learning process, the nuclear learning process. Their relation was stabilized. Argument number 3. Rogue states, future nuclear powers may be rogue states and therefore guided by a first use doctrine rather than by a non-first use doctrine. They might be guided by a first use doctrine, not necessarily in the meaning of their being tempted to attack with a nuclear weapon, but to aggress conventionally with conventional non-intranuclear weapons their neighbors, because they have expansionist aims in the region these troublemakers are located. And then, thanks to their nuclear weapon, they would deter foreign major powers from intervening, since they could retaliate with nuclear weapons. So it's not as an offense, it would not be a first offensive use, but it would be a first defensive use in order to prevent foreign powers from intervening against them after they did themselves aggress their neighbor. So they would use their nuclear arsenal as a blackmail device. This argument presupposes that there is a link between the autocratic, rogue nature of a state, of its domestic regime, and its aggressive foreign policy behavior. It is a liberal argument, liberal in the meaning of international relations theory, that according to liberals, the foreign policy behavior of a state is the result of its domestic regime. It is not constrained by the international anarchical structure as claimed by realists. I would say that there is no empirical record, there's no empirical proof, evidence of this link between an autocratic regime and an expansionist behavior. Very few states are revolutionary. Very, even less than that, few states practice revolutionary foreign policy. And even fewer states remain revolutionary over time. The best example is China. China in the 1960s looked like what nowadays we would call a rogue regime, a rogue state. During Mao's Cultural Revolution in the 60s, tens of millions of Chinese died as a consequence of the Cultural Revolution, which did not prevent a lot of French intellectuals, Sartre, Foucault, etc., to be very fond of Mao's regime. And Mao was known for being very provocative in his discourses. This is what he said. Let us imagine how many people would die in the case of a war, nuclear war breaking out. He had the nuclear weapon since 1964. Let us imagine how many people would die. There are nowadays, in the 1960s, 2.7 billion people. Let's imagine that the half, 50% would die. Well, in this case, imperialism would be raised off, would be raised to the ground, because there are less people living in imperialist regimes, capitalist Western democracies, than in China. So China would be better off. And after a few years, there would be 2 billion people again, thanks to the people procreating, of course. This was the typical talk, tough talk, but actually cheap talk of Mao. He never used any nuclear weapon. I gave you the example of his dispute with the Soviet Union in 1969, a small quarrel. Only some 10 or so soldiers would die. So he waged wars against India in 1962, against Vietnam in 1979 to punish Vietnam for having interfered in Cambodia, but small, limited, conventional wars. So Mao, though being a very, very rogue act at that time, if we can use this concept to the past, never acted expansionist in expansionist ways, in aggressive ways. And compared to Mao, contemporary rogue states are dwarfs. All the states that may be tempted, be they rogue or not, that may be tempted to look for atomic weapons, to be eager to acquire nuclear weapons, are not looking for them for offensive reasons. They are looking for them for defensive reasons. Why did India acquire a nuclear weapon in the 70s? Because of China possessing a nuclear weapon since the 60s. Why was Pakistan interested in becoming a nuclear power? Because India, its rival, had acquired a nuclear weapon. Why was Iran, during the last decade, interested in becoming a nuclear power? Because the US had attacked Iraq in 2003. And I remember the different analyses that were put forward at that time in American journals of international relations. Iran cannot but look for the nuclear weapon in order for defending itself. Yes, states are eager to acquire nuclear weapons in order to defend themselves for security reasons, not to attack or to blackmail. This is the analysis of Alexander Debs and Nina Montero. Nuclear politics, strategic cause of proliferation, the strategic causes are security reasons. Why did France acquire its nuclear dissuasion nationale, its national deterrence, to make sure it could be able to deter a Soviet attack, since the Fourth Republic, and not merely de Gaulle, did not bet on America accepting to die for the French in the case of the Soviets attacking France. So it is a national security interest which explains why states are interested, in the case they are, to acquire nuclear weapons, not in order to blackmail major powers or to aggress indirectly non-nuclear neighbors. Last argument, the risk of terrorists acquiring nuclear weapons, and of course the risks of those terrorists accepting to commit suicide, that is to say, to use nuclear weapons in order to kill their enemies. First of all, regarding this argument, there is no risk of any nuclear power, even a prospective rogue nuclear power. There is no risk that such a nuclear power transfers its nuclear weapons to terrorist networks, for a very simple reason that by definition, terrorist networks are unlikely to be controlled. It would be too risky for any regime to transfer nuclear weapons to a terrorist network, even a terrorist network close ideologically or sponsored by the nuclear rogue power. Take the example of the Soviets and the Chinese, very, very close ideologically. The beginning of the 50s, never, as communist regimes, never did the Soviet Union even help the Chinese to acquire nuclear weapons. And this was one of the reasons of the dispute between the Chinese and the Soviets a bit later, which ended up in their confrontation in the 60s. So no risk of any transfer from a nuclear power to a network, which amounts to saying that terrorist networks would be able themselves to acquire nuclear weapons without the help of anybody else. This is the possibility which is often alluded to by those who talk of suitcase bombs, Suitcase bombs are small nuclear bombs that might be stolen or bought illegally. Of course, the risk existed, or the perception of such a risk existed after the breakup of the Soviet Union. The Red Army crumbled. The huge amount, the hundreds and thousands of Soviet officers lost their job. And so there was a risk, this was the Western perception, of them being tempted to sell nuclear secrets to rogue actors. Actually, never did any loose nukes or nuclear suitcase bombs exist. There is no risk even for contemporary nuclear weapons to be transferred, to be acquired, to be bought, purchased by terrorist networks for the simple reason that there are technological locks on contemporary nuclear bombs, which means that if they are tampered, they do destroy themselves without provoking a nuclear explosion. So technologically, the nuclear weapons that exist are controlled. They cannot be used by terrorist networks who do not know what technology existed. So terrorists, therefore, should be able to build their own bomb, which amounts to saying that they must be able to acquire the fissile material. They must be able to manufacture the bomb, the device, the nuclear device. They must be able to transport it, since they do not have the missiles, of course. And they must have the money to finance this fairly costly process. It is very, very, very unlikely that this is possible. Which amounts to saying, and I would like to quote the very optimist John Mueller, page 238. Given the technological and organizational hurdles, obstacles, the likelihoods that terrorists will be able to build or to acquire nuclear weapons is vanishingly small. Vanishingly small. There is almost no risk at all of terrorist networks acquiring nuclear weapons in order to use them. I therefore am pretty optimistic, but I would even go further, a bit more critical. And in order to do so, I would like to go back to Kenneth Waltz, the only one not to be victim of this nuclear alarmism. Look at his document number 3. Look at his analysis of why Iran should get the bomb, document number 3. Policymakers, I quote, and citizens in the Arab world, in Europe, in Israel, and the United States should take comfort from the fact that history has shown that where the nuclear capabilities emerge, so too does stability. Where nuclear capabilities emerge, stability is the consequence. When it comes to nuclear weapons, now as ever, he refers to what he had written 30 years earlier in the 1980s. When it comes to nuclear weapons, now as ever, more may be better. So he was favorable to Iran getting the nuclear bomb, and in general, he's favorable to the states able to do so to acquire nuclear bombs, because they stabilize their immediate neighborhood, and if they are major powers, the whole system. He also published a more general argument in his debate with Sagan. So, as ever, more may be better, and nuclear spread, as ever, more may be better, and as ever, in international politics, the biggest dangers come from the biggest powers. The biggest dangers come from the biggest powers. The smallest dangers come from the smallest powers. So it's not rogue states, which are small by definition, that are likely to destabilize international politics. It is the biggest powers. Why is this the case? And why is Kenneth Waltz right? He's right because his analysis is corroborated by the behavior of major powers, in this case, nuclear powers, the official ones. Official nuclear powers, what did they do? They established the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in order to prevent non-nuclear states from acquiring nuclear weapons. Look at document number 2, Article 1. What does the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty say? Article number 1, the nuclear weapon states, the 5 ones at the time, still 5 official ones, India, Pakistan, and Israel did not sign it, so they did not violate it. North Korea withdrew from it, so it doesn't violate it either. The 5 nuclear powers, the 5 nuclear weapon states, promised not to transfer their nuclear technology to non-nuclear states. And Article 2, the non-nuclear states signing the treaty commit themselves, promise not to try to acquire, etc. This is what we all think of when talking about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We forget Article number 6. Article number 6, each of the parties, including the nuclear ones, each of the parties undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith. Negotiations on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race. So we do promise to stop the nuclear arms race, we, nuclear powers. And we promise to move towards, I quote, a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. We, nuclear powers, do promise to promote a treaty, to move towards a treaty on control, on complete disarmament. Did the nuclear powers keep their promise? They did not. They prevent horizontal proliferation, other states from acquiring them, but they do practice themselves vertical proliferation. This is, they improve their own nuclear weapons. And of course, they do not want to get rid of them. Though they accept the 2 major ones, the US and the USSR, Russia, to dismantle a significant part, but this is not the case of the French, the Chinese, the British. In 2017, the UN adopted a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The promotion of this treaty had been made by a non-governmental organization, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And this international campaign, the NGO, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, obtained the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. The treaty will be entered into force next January, so in 2 months or so, because 50 states did ratify it. Very important powers such as Nicaragua, such as Honduras, such as St. Kitts and Nevis, Fiji Islands, etc. Which amounts to saying that the major powers did not sign it and did not ratify it. No official nuclear power ratified it. No member of NATO ratified it. The position of France in the domain of nuclear weapons is very ambiguous. You may know that France waited 20 long years before signing the Non-Proliferation Treaty, even more than 20 long years. At the very beginning of the 1990s, the treaty was signed in 1968. And France is pretty often tempted to incite Europe, all the more so Great Britain, the other nuclear power in Europe, is no longer a member of the European Union, is pretty often tempted to permit Europe to become a nuclear power in its discourse, of course, which amounts to saying that France regarding nuclear weapons is anything but eager to get rid of them. I prove this argument by listening to Macron.
It's time for a new international arms control agenda. That was Emmanuel Macron's message Friday at France's military academy. The French president said Europe urgently needed to chart its own path, or else it could find itself trapped in an escalating arms race.
Europeans must collectively realize that in the absence of a legal framework, They could rapidly face a new race for conventional weapons, even nuclear weapons, on their own soil. They cannot confine themselves to a role of spectator.
Highlighting France's historic role in nuclear deterrence, Macron said the country was ready to step up again today. Over the last decade, France has reduced its stock of nuclear warheads to less than 300. This still makes it the third largest nuclear power according to estimates, after the US and Russia, which both have about 7,000. Indeed, the two former Cold War adversaries continue to dominate the global nuclear agenda. US President Donald Trump has threatened not to renew the country's current arms reduction treaty with Russia. Known as New START, it was negotiated under the Obama administration and expires in 2021. Macron said Europe could no longer rely on the United States and NATO for its defense. France is the European Union's only nuclear power now that the UK is out. But Macron noted that Brexit wouldn't affect France's nuclear cooperation with the UK.
So beyond France, ladies and gentlemen, it will be my conclusion. Beyond France, the nuclear powers in general represent what we should call an obviously hierarchical dimension in an overall anarchical international system. Nuclear powers, official nuclear powers, acknowledge themselves specific rights and actually privileges. They do deny to other states, we have the nuclear weapon, I don't want you to have one. So they just reproduce in the nuclear domain what they already are benefiting from at the UN Security Council, where they are the only one as permanent members to have the veto power to oppose any resolution that they do disagree with. To put it in a nutshell, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is a means for major powers to maintain their very select gentlemen's club. And the nuclear obsession is a kind of rhetoric, a mere kind of rhetoric aiming at justifying their oligopoly. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening. I wish you a great day, and I hope to see you again next week. Goodbye.